So, picking up with entertainment context. Again, we're talking about this sort of visually extravagant academic theater, and on the other hand, we're talking about everyday theater for the people, improvised comedy and commedia. So let's talk about this court or academic theater. By and large, this form of Italian Renaissance theater is funded by merchants and nobles. This becomes wealthy people owning and building theaters on their own estates and inviting their wealthy friends over to show them how much money they have that they can spend on this beautiful, amazing theater. So we're talking about highly wealthy people here, right? They're private, they're elaborate, and they're almost always indoors. And the whole point of them is to demonstrate your ability to execute the visual indulgence of the Renaissance, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and also the academic indulgence, the notion that you understand Greek and Roman theater and you can reproduce it on your stage, in your backyard, or in your palace, and bring other wealthy people in. So the court and academic theaters are very showy. They're very over the top in terms of their visuals, and the kind of plays they put on are actually not that great. On the other side, like I said, we've got commedia with traveling players and improv comedy, and this is public entertainment. This is entertainment for the people. So, when we talk about this world of this visually over-the-top, extravagant theater, we have to talk about the development of perspective drawing in the Renaissance. Here is an early / pre-Renaissance painting by Giotto called Lamentation. This is obviously Christ is our central figure here. You'll notice that there isn't a lot of realistic three-dimensional perspective in this painting. It feels flat. Depth is hard to come by, and there's a little attempt with the tree to provide some depth in being, things are far away, so therefore they're smaller. But not much. The painting overall feels flat. We shift to the development of perspective painting. That is, single vanishing point perspective gives us an opportunity to paint three-dimensional objects in a realistic fashion. Again, in modern drawing, this doesn't seem like that big a deal, but in the Renaissance, people basically hadn't done this before. They hadn't figured it out. So drawing becomes mathematical. So when you're creating a painting, you need to think about where that central vanishing point is. Again, it's basic drawing of three-dimensional objects. And then all lines, all vanishing lines need to move to that point on the horizon. Also, this gives you the opportunity for symbolism in your drawings because, as you'll notice, all of the lines on this painting move to the same vanishing point, which is Mother Mary's womb. So you can add an extra level of symbolism. But this stuff just gets really visually indulgent and really complicated. It almost becomes mathematical. Here's a sketch for Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi. This is just a sketch for one portion of a Da Vinci painting. And look at how much grid work he did, graphing, mathematically kind of working out the correct perspective so that everything looks as realistic as possible. Notice that in the actual version of the Adoration of the Magi, that sketch I showed you is a tiny portion of what's going on here. So we get, in the Italian Renaissance, a beautiful and impressive execution of perspective painting. This leads us to backdrops for plays. These visually indulgent, as you see has one example here, right? These visually indulgent, three-dimensionally painted flat backdrops. So what you see, this would be the backdrop for a play. Remember we read Brothers earlier in the semester, we read that Roman play. Imagine basically every scene in Brothers taking place on this city street. It's a generic location. Here's another one, right? These don't represent realistic actual places. They're just general street scene locations. And they are painted to give the impression of, oh look, I the owner of this private theater, have hired the most skilled and talented craftsmen, and they've drawn this elaborate painted flat backdrop that my actors can stand in front of. This is an actual set. You can't really work with much of this stuff because it's all just a canvas hanging behind you. This stuff becomes even more exaggerated and even more elaborate. And you see in these images the obsession with vanishing point perspective, the obsession with nuanced, super detailed drawing in all of this stuff. And it becomes showy. It's almost like, wow, how extravagant can I make my flat painted backdrop? And the figures you see in the foreground here are represented as actors, and the drawing is designed to make them look like they are standing in the set, but in real execution, this would have just been a flat painted backdrop with actors standing in front of it. So, Perhaps the most interesting and lavish and over-the-top version of all of this stuff is the Teatro Olimpico, which is built in Vincenza. It was built from 1580 to 1584, commissioned by the Olympic Academy of Vincenza. So the Teatro Olimpico is an academic exercise in reproducing the ideas of Greece and Rome. And again, if I go back to these slides here, you can see there is a huge obsession with Greek and Roman design here. The columns, the arches, all of it is intended to be very lavish and very elaborate and very neoclassical, Greek and Roman, right? So the Teatro Olimpico is commissioned by the Olympic Academy of Vincenza, so it's basically an intellectual exercise. But the wealthy elite of Vincenza also pour a lot of money into this thing. It's an indoor theater, it has a 3,000 seat capacity, and it still exists today. So here's what this thing is. As you can see, instead of just doing the flat painted backdrop, which was normal for the era, the Teatro Olimpico actually executes those things and creates this elaborate, wonderfully visually neoclassical background for any play to be performed in front of. If you want to look down, if you sit in the center of the auditorium and look straight down it, here you can see vanishing perspective. And guys, because this is built, that thing actually gets smaller as you go down the hallway. So if you were to walk to the end of that hallway and stand in that arch at the far end of the hallway down here, you would look like you were 30 feet tall. What they're doing is visually showing off and saying, look how amazing and elaborate we can build this thing. Look how much money we can spend. Here's the ground plan for it. And you'll notice each audience member gets his or her own particular corridor that they can look down to see, right, to get the advantage of this like amazing, visually extravagant perspective drawing. And this stuff is complex, it is detailed, it is highly scientific, and the plays that are performed on these stages are uninteresting. They are boring reproductions of Greek and Roman tragedies, and not always the best ones, and not always very interesting. They're more like theater as an academic exercise. Here's another great example of a neoclassical theater that is visually extravagant, beautiful, and totally impractical. Right? So in talking about practicality, look at the acting space here. You don't have a whole lot you can do. We're just acting in front of this flat, effectively flat backdrop. You can walk in the arch and make an entrance, but there isn't a lot of complexity there in terms of storytelling. Same goes for the Teatro Farnese, which is in Parma and is built in 1618. Here's a picture of the proscenium. I'm sorry, not of the proscenium, of the auditorium. So you have this great, enormous space in the middle where either seating could be had, or we could have like horses riding around, sort of military events, battle scenes, pageant scenes, all that kind of stuff. It's visually extravagant. And then here's the actual arch. And what you're seeing here is a painting or a sketch of it, and then a photograph of the actual thing. So this is the world's first proscenium arch. It is designed like a picture frame to frame the action. It is not in any way, shape, or form visually appropriate to good storytelling. I would like to remind you, in terms of good storytelling, look how far the audience is away from the theater, or from the actual stage. The audience is sitting over here in the archway area, right, or even further back here, and the proscenium and the action is all the way over there. We're not trying to tell good stories here. We're trying to be visually extravagant and show off to the other wealthy nobles who have come how great this theater is, and how much money we spent on it, and how much we understand what Greek and Roman culture looks like. So you see, it's gorgeous, and it is definitely Greco-Roman in its attitude, the arches and all of it. It just feels very much like a reproduction of what they were doing in Greece and Rome, but it doesn't go anywhere. And that ultimately is the legacy of all of this heavily visual, highly academic theater, is that, as we'll see as we move forward in the semester, we'll see these flat painted three-dimensional backdrops. We'll see them used especially in France and a handful of other neoclassical places, the Restoration England. But by and large, other than flat painted three-dimensional backdrops, all of this visual academic obsession with neoclassical culture doesn't really do a lot for theater. When we talk in Renaissance France about the neoclassical ideal, that doesn't really do a lot for theater either. It really limits theater and causes theater not to develop in a bunch of different ways. So it's interesting, it's beautiful, it's mainly theater by, for, and about rich people, talking about rich, historical, dusty, boring stuff, and it's visually extravagant. Other than that, it's just kind of a moment that happens in theater, and it has a handful of influences later on, but not very many. Next, then, we'll talk about commedia, entertainment for the people, which does have some huge influence on theater and entertainment going forward.